Chair will call the markup to order. And the chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. Today we're holding this markup to advance this important bill, the Transparency and Regulatory Analysis of Impacts on the Nation Act, called the TRAIN Act. Why are we doing this? I knew that everyone would want to know why we're doing this. Recently, EPA has come out with greenhouse gas permitting rules, boiler MAC rules, utility MAC rules, ozone national ambient air quality standards, which will be coming out soon. Yesterday, what was the Clean Air Transport rules, now the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule, the coal ash rule, the sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, review of secondary National Ambient Air Quality Standards for NOx and SOx, particulate matter, greenhouse gas new source performance standards, regional haze rules, and others. And we think at this time in our nation's economy, when we are struggling to get the economy going again and create jobs, that it's imperative that we have some idea of the cumulative impact of regulations of this depth, this comprehensiveness, and its impact on our ability to create jobs. The TRAIN Act was introduced by Subcommittee Vice Chairman Sullivan and Representative Matheson to require analysis of the cumulative impact of rules and actions that have a major impact on our energy prices, our economy, and jobs. EPA has already done analysis of the individual rules in the TRAIN Act, and this legislation would require a cumulative analysis of all of these actions. While we think that the analysis required by the TRAIN Act should be completed as part of a responsible regulatory program using existing resources that the agency uses for all of their regulatory analysis, this reintroduced legislation accounts for the complexities of CBO scoring. So the reintroduced TRAIN Act, H.R. 2401, includes an authorization of $3.5 million. I would like to commend Vice Chairman Sullivan and Representative Matheson for their work to build support for this important bill and for their work to address cut-go requirements. I think that this is a very important piece of legislation to give us a better understanding of what they're doing at EPA. And I look forward to our successfully marking up this bill today. And I yield back the balance of my time. This time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Rush, for 3 minutes for his opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, we know that since the inception of the Clean Air Act, opponents of the law have been exaggerating the cost of implementing the regulations associated with the Act while downplaying the benefits that the new rules have brought. I'm afraid that today's markup on the TRAIN Act may be yet another example of this type of shoddy accounting and shady legislating. This bill would highlight the cost of implementing certain EPA rules, but does not take into account all of the benefits of these regulations, including enhanced public health, increased job productivity, or the lives saved. This bill will also not take into account the positive impacts that EPA regulations have had on our nation's economy, including spurring additional research and development of clean energy technologies, instituting higher fuel efficiency standards, and helping make the country less dependent on foreign oil. As written, this bill will not give an accurate cost-benefit analysis of EPA's regulations. The Office of Management and Budget examined 10 Clear Air Act regulations finalized in 08, 09, and in 2010, and concluded that all 10 had benefits that far exceeded costs by a ratio of 7 to 1 on average. During debate over the Clean Air Act, there were dire warnings that environmental regulations would kill jobs and lead to outsourcing to overseas. However, when both direct employment and indirect employment are taken into account, the environmental protection industry is estimated to have created a range of 3.8 million to 5 million new jobs. So today, Mr. Chairman, I will offer an amendment to help strengthen this bill by making sure that the panel created to study EPA regulations is objective, is balanced, and that it does take into account both the benefits to the environment and the public health, as well as to the cost to industry. I urge all of my colleagues to support my amendment, and with that I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair recognizes the full committee chairman, Mr. Upton, for 3 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's markup does address a critical information gap that is emerging as the nation grapples with the unprecedented wave of proposed and recently promulgated major regs from EPA. The cumulative impact of all these measures, this bill, H.R. 2401, the TRAIN Act, establishes an interagency committee that will provide a much-needed analysis of the cumulative burden. The analysis will help both the agency in implementing the rules as well as Congress in its oversight role, and I want to particularly applaud the efforts of Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Matheson on the bill. The ultimate goal of the TRAIN Act is to preserve jobs and American competitiveness by providing info necessary to harmonize these regs. For example, we all want to avoid situations where one regulation requires a costly upgrade of a factory 1 year, but then a conflicting reg requires the upgrade to be replaced with something else the next year. And we don't want to implement multiple regs on electric power plants that may be individually doable, but cumulatively place so many units offline for repairs that system reliability and jobs are jeopardized. Of course, manufacturers, energy producers, other job creators don't have the luxury of picking and choosing which major reg to obey. They have to comply with all that apply to them. And despite marked improvements in air quality and other environmental measures since EPA was created in 1970, the number and stringency of new regs is completely without precedent. Unfortunately, EPA's analysis looks at rules individually and thus misses the bigger picture, both potential problems as well as opportunities to avoid them. Because the agencies involved in TRAIN are already employing economic experts in performing analyses, these agencies should be able to coordinate and improve their efforts without significantly increasing their spending. That is currently our intent. However, this bill, newly reintroduced, accounts for the complexities of the CBO's scoring rule by including a $3.5 million authorization and a corresponding offset in the annual authorization for the Diesel Emission Reduction Act of 2010, a program that received massive infusions from the stimulus package that otherwise has yet to be appropriated at authorized levels and was zeroed out in the President's FY12 budget request. So this TRAIN Act represents a worthwhile attempt to provide information that could help avoid substantial and unnecessary regulatory costs in the years ahead. I yield back.
Thank you. At this time, the chair recognizes the ranking member from California, Mr. Waxman, for 3 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the subcommittee considers H.R. 2401, a revised version of the TRAIN Act, which requires additional studies of EPA regulations. This bill is called the TRAIN Act because energy lobbyists have been complaining that regulations to protect public health from power plant air pollution will cause a train wreck for the reliability of the nation's electric system. This is another one of those myths that have become so commonplace in this room, like the myth that climate change is a hoax. Analysts have found that EPA regulations won't cause a train wreck or even a fender bender. Just last month, the Bipartisan Policy Center released a new report that finds impacts on the reliability of the electric system are manageable while delivering significant public health and environmental benefits. CEOs of leading electric utilities have said the same thing. H.R. 2401 is seriously flawed. I support the effort to have good information about the potential impacts of regulation, but I can't support proposals that are one-sided or that will waste taxpayers' dollars with redundant or infeasible analyses. One problem is that the bill calls for an analysis of only the costs of regulation, not their benefits. It asks for an analysis of the impacts of EPA regulations on the, quote, the global economic competitiveness of the United States, end quote, but not on the benefits of mitigating global climate change. It calls for an analysis of the impact of facility closures, but not of the facility openings that will be created by investments in clean energy. Another problem is the feasibility of the legislation. The bill requires a new government committee to analyze actions that may be taken by federal, state, and local regulators over the next 20 years. This speculative effort must be completed by next August using state-of-the-art economic modeling. There's a real question of whether this is even remotely feasible. Unlike the previous version of this legislation, H.R. 2401 complies with the discretionary cut-go rule. Unfortunately, it does so by slashing the authorization for the effective and popular Diesel Emissions Reduction Act, or DERA. For months, Republicans on this committee have been saying that we need to cut the size of government to create private sector jobs. This bill now does the exact opposite. It cuts a program that has created thousands of good-paying jobs in the private sector to fund the creation of a new government bureaucracy. Our manufacturing sector is at last showing signs of growth, and programs like DERA are one of the reasons. The last thing we should be doing is savaging a proven job-creating program like DERA to create an unnecessary government committee. That is why I will be opposing this bill today.
Thank you. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Sullivan, who's one of the primary sponsors of this legislation, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield. Thank you for holding this subcommittee markup today. This important bill we are considering today, H.R. 2401, the Transparency and Regulatory Analysis of Impacts on the Nation Act of 2011, TRAIN Act, which I reintroduced last month with my good friend and colleague Jim Matheson to address the cumulative cost of 12 economically significant EPA regulations and actions. We reintroduced the bill to include certain changes, primarily to ensure the Congressional Budget Office accounting of any possible costs of the legislation accurately reflects the bill's intent and structure. The bill, as currently drafted, includes an authorization of spending to anticipate a ceiling for what this regulatory analysis could cost, along with corresponding offsets. However, I continue to believe the agencies can and should conduct this type of rigorous economic analysis with existing resources, particularly in light of record debt and deficits. At the end of the day, however, the TRAIN Act is designed to ultimately protect taxpayers and our economy by more clearly identifying the cost of burdensome regulations. The agency should be able to conduct these analyses without asking the taxpayer for more of their hard-earned dollars. Each of these regulations handed down from Washington and imposed upon American manufacturers and energy suppliers have an impact on American jobs and consumers. But the real question for which we have no answer is how all of these rules taken together, layered on top of each other, and confusingly intertwined affect national job creation, the reliability and cost of our energy supply, and the ability of American companies to compete on the global stage. In fact, 8 of APA's proposed regulations cost a minimum of $1 billion on the U.S. economy. The time to address the full economic burden of these regulations is now. What will all of these regulations cost? EPA doesn't know, and it has failed to conduct a study of the overall cumulative cost of many of their regulations together, which is why this legislation is so important. We desperately need an honest accounting of EPA's economically significant regulations, which this bipartisan legislation will accomplish. I encourage my colleagues from both sides of the aisle to support this common sense measure. Also, I'd like to mention the fact that Congressman Waxman mentioned that we don't do any benefit. EPA doesn't do any benefit. That's all the EPA does is evaluate the benefits. That's all they do. And just to some of these costs, on these regulations, just on greenhouse gas permitting, they don't even know what that's going to cost. It'd be billions. Boiler MAC rules, the cost is $2.2 billion annually. Who's going to pay that? The consumer. We have unemployment rates are high, jobless, jobs are down. Utility MAC, $10.9 billion. Ozone, $19 billion to $90 billion annually.
Gentlemen, yield.
Time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen, yield.
For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Well, I just wanted to point out that EPA is required to do a cost-benefit analysis. OMB does a cost-benefit analysis. I think it's inaccurate to say that all EPA does is look at the benefits and not the costs. That's just an absolutely inaccurate statement.
No, I would agree with the gentleman. They do look at costs and benefits, but some of the comments that have been made would indicate that we're not interested in benefits, and we already know the supposed benefits because it's in EPA's analysis.
Mr. Chairman. They don't look at the...
Well, you also know about the cost
Answer
because
that.
it's in EPA's analysis.
Would the gentleman yield?
Not cumulative costs.
Exactly. They don't do the cumulative.
And that's our only interest from our
What
perspective.
about cumulative benefits, Mr. Chairman? What about cumulative benefits?
We've added up all those cumulative benefits, and we think costs exceed that. But anyway, does anyone else seek recognition for an opening statement this morning? All right. The gentleman from West Virginia is recognized for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The EPA must be held accountable and reined in. Everything from their science to their economic analysis is blatantly and ideologically biased. As a result, America's economy continues to suffer. In April, a study by the Phoenix Center analyzing 49 years of data showed that a 5% reduction in the federal government's regulatory budget would increase our nation's GDP by $75 billion annually and would create nearly 1.2 million jobs annually. According to Susan Dudley of George Washington University, among all the regulations the Obama administration has produced, 132 have each exceeded $100 million in costs. This is a clear message signaling that we need to rein in this rogue agency. I look forward to passing H.R. 2401, a step finally in the right direction. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McKinley. Does anyone else seek recognition for an opening statement?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as you know, I happen to be one of those on this side of the aisle that's not a real fan of a lot of what I see as East Coast energy generators for a lot of reasons. But I'll tell you something. It frustrates me ever since I got here in '95 that there is a concept, the cost effectiveness, that economic impact is somehow an enemy of an environmental strategy. I think it is not only the right thing to do, it is imperative to do if you want to talk about a sustained effort at improving the environmental situation across the board. You've got to look at cost effectiveness. And in California, where, let's face it, we're not exactly been backsliding on environmental issues, it is not only encouraged, it's mandated by our state laws that the economic impact of a proposal has to be a consideration, and you have to look at alternatives to try to reduce the economic impact of any environmental strategy. I think this is just fitting what we've done. Now, sadly, I got to say, is even with that mandate, California is now sitting at 12% unemployment. I just think that we ought to work to make sure that we don't do for America what we've done to California, where jobs and opportunity are being driven.
Gentleman's time has expired. Does anyone else seek recognition for an opening statement? Gentlelady from Florida is recognized for 1 minute for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm so happy to join the subcommittee. And I think I come at a very interesting time because I wasn't involved in the development of this act, but it's clear just at first impression this is very poor public policy. To say that the EPA does not take into consideration the economic considerations or economic costs of regulation simply is not the case. And if you go into the record, the EPA has completed regulatory impact analyses for all the final rules that you mentioned under this TRAIN Act in accordance with very detailed requirements set out by the OMB. And these documents are thousands of pages in length and provide a remarkable level of detail and analysis. And I think what's happening is folks just don't like the result, that when you protect the public health and when you protect the environment, oftentimes that results in great cost savings for families and businesses all across the country. I'm also struck by the fact that this bill adds unnecessary bureaucratic red tape. It adds unnecessary costs to regulatory processes, and I thought that was something you were trying to combat. So very poor public policy. This review committee is flawed, and we shouldn't be adding unnecessary bureaucratic red tape and costs to the regulatory process. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, this is great public policy. It's in compliance with the President's executive order of January. If the EPA was doing such a great job, why would the President have to issue an executive order in January for his agencies to comply with the job and economic analysis? The reason why he did that is because they weren't, and the reason why we're doing this is because they still don't. So that's... Job reports came out today. We're back up to 9.2% unemployment. Only 19,000 jobs were created. It's 135,000 below expectations. The fossil fuel industry is one of the best productive job creators in this country. We're just defending the right for our workers to have good paying jobs with good wages and low cost energy so every American benefits. So that's why they have to do this. That's why this law is important.
Thank you, Mr. Shumkus. Does anyone else seek recognition for an opening statement? The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you bringing this bill today, and we're trying in this legislation to rein in some of the radical regulations by the EPA, but you look at the job numbers that just came out today and the unemployment numbers. We saw another uptick in unemployment. And when you talk to job creators around the country, the first thing they tell you, the thing that holds them back from creating new jobs in America are these regulations by these different agencies and radical policies that are coming out that have a real impact on jobs. There was just a study done by the Small Business Administration that said the cost of regulations to each American family is $15,000 per family. You talk about kicking somebody when they're down. And so we're bringing these bills to try to roll back some of these radical regulations to say let's have sanity in our fiscal policy so people can get back to work. But when you talk to the job creators, as we look at an increase in unemployment that we just saw today, the job creators are saying it's these regulations that are stopping them from creating jobs and getting people back to work. So I applaud you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this bill. Hopefully we can get it through and get the Senate to start taking some action on these bills to create jobs. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Scalise. Mr. Pompeo, do you want to do an opening statement? Ms. Capps? Okay. The chair will now call up H.R. 2401 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 2401 to require analyses of the cumulative and incremental impacts of certain rules and...
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. In keeping with the chairman's policy, are there any bipartisan amendments? If there are no bipartisan amendments, are there any amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment that I hope will be a bipartisan amendment, but I'm not convinced about it right now, but I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment of Mr. Rush.
An amendment offered by Mr. Rush of Illinois.
It's amendment number 34.
Without objection, then the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in almost every single bill introduced in this subcommittee under the banner of the so-called, I quote, American Energy Initiative, end of quote, the majority has attempted to reduce the red tape and streamline the process to make it easier for oil companies to drill without delay, even if it meant sidestepping the input of states and local communities. A case in point is the Shell bill that passed out of this subcommittee in May, which would have made it easier for Shell to acquire the permits they need to begin drilling in the Outer Continental Shelf in Alaska in an expeditious manner by cutting out state and community input. Another example is the Trans-Canada bill, which the majority also passed out of this subcommittee in June, which would force the administration to come to a decision on the Keystone XL pipeline by an arbitrary November the 1st deadline, regardless of whether or not the appropriate agencies had the time to conduct their due diligence. Yet, Mr. Chairman, in this piece of legislation, the TRAIN Act, we have the majority, the same majority, attempting to do just the opposite. Add an extra layer of red tape and create yet another committee to study the impacts of proposed EPA regulations to delay implementation, even though by law the agency is already required to do so. Unfortunately, my friends on the other side conveniently left off the health effects of the proposed regulations as one of, quote, cumulative impacts, end quote, that this bill would analyze. I understand that for some of my colleagues, if a regulation cannot be monetized, then it has no benefit. But for many communities that do not have the money and connections of the oil and gas industries, there is no more important benefit than protecting their health and their livelihoods. So the amendment that I'm offering here today will do precisely that. It will amend this bill to include important environmental protection and health agencies that were omitted from the original draft. My amendment would add the chair of the Council on Environmental Quality, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, as well as the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, among others, to the interagency council that this bill would create. Additionally, my amendment would direct the committee to look at important health impacts that would be affected by EPA's proposed rules, including asthma rates, birth defects, premature mortality, or the effect of promoting clean energy jobs and technologies. If the majority was worried that existing studies focus too heavily on health and environmental impacts of proposed EPA rules and did not sufficiently take into account the jobs and economic analysis, then let's not make the very same mistake in this bill. Let's make sure that this new committee has a balanced and unbiased approach if the majority feels that previous studies were indeed slanted. By including health and environmental impacts of proposed EPA rules, we can ensure that this bill enjoys the support of a much larger coalition, even bipartisanship, maybe, as it moves through the legislative process. So, Mr. Chairman, with that said, I urge all of my colleagues to support this amendment. It's a common sense amendment, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Anyone seek recognition, speak in opposition to the amendment? Mr. Griffin from Virginia is recognized to speak in opposition.
Mr. Chairman, we had a similar amendment, I believe, when we were doing this once before, and I raised this point then, and I know that my colleague means well and that he and I will probably never agree, but my problem with the amendment is that if we're really going to do this in the right way, we shouldn't just talk about the reductions in each one of these things where he talks about reduction in asthma, reduction in this, the effect of promoting clean energy jobs. We ought to be looking at the loss of other jobs, the reduction in the occurrence of other adverse health effects. We should also be looking at the increase in asthma and asthma attacks and increase in other adverse health effects if we're going to do this properly. Because from my viewpoint, what we're doing is we're now at a point where we're creating so many new regulations.
Will the gentleman yield?
Not at this moment, but I'll be happy to in a minute. But what we're doing is I believe we're actually increasing a lot of these health concerns that I think the gentleman legitimately holds, because what we're doing is the cost of electricity goes up as it will, and the cost of other fuels go up as it will. When you're looking at a district like mine that has a median household income of roughly $35,000 per year, what you're looking at is that people won't use their air conditioner when it gets hot because they can't afford it. They will lower the temperature. They'll probably not put it down at freezing, of course, but they'll lower the temperature if they can afford it, and that creates health problems. And then we have the testimony that we've had in this committee where, you know, if we move a lot of these regulations forward, we'll be moving jobs to Mexico and China and other places where they don't have the regulations that we currently have, and we put those pollutants into the air. And as long as it's in the northern hemisphere, we're sharing it, and I believe we're greatly increasing the pollution long term in the United States by moving our manufacturing jobs to other countries where they don't have the regulations and they're still putting the pollutants into the air. And so I think this amendment is flawed because it doesn't deal with the overall effects on when you look at your page 2, lines 3 through at least 11. We're not looking at anything but the reductions, and we're not looking at it from a worldwide viewpoint, and I believe that we're actually should be looking at increases in all of those things happening as a result of the regulations, because while they may be well-intentioned, I think they're actually going to end up doing, long term, they're going to end up doing exactly the opposite of what the regulations intended to do and what its stated purposes are. I will now yield to the gentleman.
I think the gentleman makes a fine point. If the gentleman wants to add increases to that the bill should deal with, my amendment should deal with increases in asthma and other health benefits, I have no objection. If the gentleman offered an amendment to include increases, then I have no objection to that. I mean, I think that's he makes my point. So, you know.
Would the gentleman yield? The gentleman from Virginia?
I yield.
I think the point is that our position is the EPA doesn't take cost-benefit analysis, doesn't address the economic impacts. An example that I can quote is of an industry that to comply with greenhouse gases, they have to heat their boilers up to a higher level, but then they fall into noncompliance on the NOx. So that's a perfect example of rules and regulations that can't be complied. So the EPA is already going to do all this health analysis. That's not why this bill is moving. Our point is they're not doing a cumulative aspect on jobs and the economy. And we say that should be part of the analysis. They're already going to try to get us to zero emissions on every little particle, even naturally found in the environment. They'll try to get us below naturally found elements. Our point is there is an economic price to be paid by doing that. That's the benefit of this, the Train Act legislation. That's why I would reject my good friend and colleague from Chicago, Illinois' amendment. I yield back to my gentleman from Virginia.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone seek? A gentleman from California is recognized to speak in favor of the amendment.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, it appears to me that what the other side of the aisle is saying is they don't like regulations, so they want to strangulate them by analysis, paralysis by analysis. Well, I support the Rush Amendment. The idea behind this legislation was supposed to be that we needed a further evaluation of the pluses and the minuses. But what I really hear is that the other side thinks we can't trust the EPA. We need to have a broad group of government agencies engaged in order to understand the effects of regulation. Well, I fundamentally disagree with this premise. If anything, EPA has historically overestimated the cost of compliance with its rules. and the public health and environmental benefits we've enjoyed have been tremendous. But if the majority really wants a second opinion from an interagency committee, they should ensure the committee is balanced. The Rush Amendment brings balance to the Train Act. Without such balance, the analysis will not be credible or useful. Even with adoption of this amendment, I would remain concerned that the required analysis may simply not be possible to conduct, but the balance provided by this amendment is essential, if not sufficient, to ensuring a high quality and credible product. At the hearing on this bill, several witnesses expressed concern that the analysis required by this bill would focus only on costs, not benefits. I appreciate that the sponsors made changes to respond in part to those concerns, but in several significant ways the analysis remains unbalanced. As currently drafted, important economic impacts like reduction in the number of work and school days missed, reduction in the occurrence of adverse health effects, and savings due to decreased use of emergency medical services would not be specifically included. The analysis would consider impacts on small businesses and agriculture, but not vulnerable subpopulations and developing infants and children. The Rush Amendment would correct that imbalance. It would also ensure that the makeup of the committee is balanced by including departments and offices with expertise in health, disease, and environmental quality. This balance is essential to ensuring a high quality and credible product. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to bring the balance to this committee and this analysis. If the members on the other side of the aisle think we need an analysis, let it be balanced and not just a one-sided analysis that will cost an enormous amount of taxpayers' dollars and create even more bureaucracy to conduct the evaluations. I'd be happy to yield to anybody who wants me to yield. Otherwise, I'll yield my time back. Yield to Mr. Rush.
Mr. Chairman, I would, as a result of the debate that we're having here, I would just ask unanimous consent that I may be able to withdraw my amendment and replace it with another amendment that I would like to replace. It's basically the same amendment. It's just making some language changes on page 2. So I ask for unanimous consent that I might be able to withdraw the original amendment and to replace it with an amended amendment with some simple language changes on page 2.
Make sure I understand. You're asking unanimous consent to withdraw this amendment and replace it with another amendment with some minor language.
Yeah, taking into account the debate that we've had so far.
Without objection.
Mr. Chair, just reserving the right to object, would it not be more proper for the gentleman to withdraw his amendment? Now, the gentleman is free to offer another amendment. Will that conform with the time requirements that we have for that amendment to be at the desk and for the other side to see the verbiage of the amendment?
Well, we do have a 2-hour requirement that an amendment be before it can be considered.
Mr. Chairman,
Point of parliamentary procedure. Point of parliamentary procedure.
What is the gentleman's parliamentary procedure?
I know of no rule that requires an amendment sit at the desk for 2 hours. That rule was instituted for the purposes of the chair recognizing members to offer an amendment so that members would have an opportunity to see it. Now, Mr. Burgess is correct. He can go through withdrawing the amendment and offering another one. He's asking to shortcut that by, through a unanimous consent that would perfect his amendment. Whatever you all want to do, but why make something so simple so hard?
Right.
Well,
without objection.
Mr. Chairman, just if I may, I'm only asking us to adhere to the Waxman rule from the last Congress, where the amendments had to be at the table. And the reason that the then chairman asked for that was to allow both sides the opportunity to fully read and digest and understand the amendment. It's my understanding now that Mr. Rush will be giving us a substitute amendment, which we've actually not had a chance to see or discuss.
Well, my understanding is that your amendment is the same, except you're changing 5 words.
Yeah, I'm changing 4 or 5 words. As a matter of fact, I'm changing. Actually, it's 10 words, but they're all the same.
Reserving the right to object, just to,
Mr. Chairman,
let's hold it 1 minute here. Now, Mr. Burgess, are you reserving a point of order?
I'll withdraw my reservation.
Reserving the right to object. I'm not going to object, but I'm just going to make a point that we went through this in the attempted markup of the in a full committee of the COASH bill. We asked for assistance by the minority to remove language under unanimous consent. Obviously, that was disapproved. So you know what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you want us to play nice, then you ought to play nice too. And that's the we could have moved that bill markup quickly.
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about the provision on language that we asked for you to unanimously consent, remove that one section so the full markup of the bill could do it. You decided not to. We postponed the markup.
That wasn't a perfecting amendment. That was to clear up a defect.
Reclaiming my time, I would just make the point that we asked, in good faith, based upon language that was flawed, for unanimous consent to move the language, and you disagreed with it.
Go ahead and punish us then.
Well, I'm just telling you.
If that's an adult way to proceed, go ahead and punish us.
I would just say, it's funny how there's a double standard every time you want to raise a ruckus, and when some people raise an issue in good conscience, which is something that you all did just 2 weeks ago, I just think it's curious.
Chairman, I object to the unanimous consent request. Let's get the amendment reoffered. We're wasting our time here.
We've learned a lot. Reclaiming my time. Reclaiming my time.
Objection.
It is my time.
Okay,
it is my time.
Just 1 minute.
Chairman Emeritus is really out of order, speaking over my time, which he's very good at doing.
Not out of order.
Mr. Shimkus has the time.
Yield back my time.
Of order, Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman.
yields back. Do you object?
I object. You want us to go through and offer an amendment to correct a few little words? If that's what the Republicans want and waste our time, then I'll offer the objection.
Okay,
let's get the amendment before us. I just want to point out how juvenile this is. You have the majority. You have the majority. You're going to vote down whatever you don't want. Can't you allow the gentleman from Illinois to add a few words? And I want to point out that when I was chairman, there was no objection to unanimous consent to perfect amendments. So if you want to carry on, then let's get the thing in order and not waste our time.
Well, are you objecting, Mr. Weiss?
Yeah.
You're going to object to the...
Well, is anyone else objecting, or they just want to reserve time to
no one's objecting on our side. I think they're just discussing some of their frustrations. But
oh, so frustrating to be in the majority. I would
without objection, the gentleman's amendment is amended.
Yeah.
Now, I would ask the gentleman to take a few minutes just to explain to us what changes he's making.
Well, Mr. Chairman, in all honesty, I started out by saying I hope that this is a bipartisan amendment, and this is an amendment for both the goose and the gander. It's not the goose order. This is a goose and the gander. This is a bipartisan amendment.
Okay.
The gentleman from Virginia made some remarks that had some meaning. So I want to amend my amendment on page 2, line 3, line 5, line 6, line 8, and line 10. And after reduction, I want to insert or increase in each one of these lines, line 3, line 5, line 7, line 8, and line 10. Add those two words.
So your language now says reduction or increase.
Or increase.
For different instances. And,
right.
Well, the gentleman's explained the amendment, and I don't think this changes the meaning of the amendment in any way. So at this time, I would ask, is there any further discussion of the gentleman's amendment?
Mr. Chairman, parliamentary inquiry, and I apologize, it's just ignorance.
The gentleman is recognized for parliamentary inquiry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some additional amendments. I had a slightly different fix, but that works. But I have some other amendments. Is it proper to offer those now or to wait until after these amendments are worked on and then bring up the additional amendments?
You, in other words, you would like to amend some of his amendment?
I would like, well...
Secondary amendments to his amendment.
No, actually, I have additional amendments to his...
Yeah.
Yes, to his amendment, that is correct.
Well, you know...
these amendments, but the amendment that he's offered to the committee.
We're going to be voting on, in just a minute, on his amendment. What I would suggest to the gentleman, if he would not object, is on Tuesday, we're going to be marking this bill up in full committee, and I think there would be an opportunity to amend at that time.
I appreciate that, and I will do that at that time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there further debate on the gentleman's amendment? Since there are no further discussion, the vote now occurs. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I seek recognition. I want to yield to Mr. Rush.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I really want, before we take this vote on this amendment, really want the other side to understand the sincerity with which I offered these amendments. The gentleman from Virginia indicated that my original amendment did not include increases to the incidence of asthma attacks or increases in the occurrence of birth and developmental effects and other kind of health issues. And so what I was sincerely trying to do was just open my amendment up, accept the gentleman's objections, and add the words or increase. And I think that really would make my amendment, should make my amendment palatable to the other side, to both the Republicans and the Democrats. And I think that this amendment is an amendment that makes in my opinion, makes bad legislation a little bit better. So with that, I yield back. I yield back to thank the gentleman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I reclaim my time. I want to just say to my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle that the facts do matter. The 2-hour notice that we used last Congress was to make sure that members had a chance to see amendments before they were offered. That's not in our rules. I announced that as a point of recognition of the chairman. And if members wanted to change their amendments, even though it hadn't been 2 hours, but that didn't make any difference. We still recognize members. You still can get recognized without any amendments sitting out there. But we did want to give preference to those who had filed their amendments, especially when we have a lot of amendments. I think we have 2 amendments on this bill. But the rules were not changed. It was simply the recognition of the chair. So I want that misunderstanding cleared up, because Mr. Burgess should not believe that this was a rule. It was a reasonable recognition by the chair to make sure that members had a full opportunity to see the amendments. I would urge, and maybe it's self-serving because we're often trying to change things, let's try to be as accommodating as possible on the small stuff, especially it looks like we disagree on the big stuff. And I would hope members would keep that in mind. It is just not unusual to allow a member to change his amendment, especially when you're going to vote against it anyway. Or if in that change, you may bring your vote for it. And so I just want to point that out as a way of dealing with each other in a way that I think respects each other. Now, there was a time that we did object to a unanimous consent request, and I thought it was appropriate to do that. That was when we had a bill that didn't meet the Cutco standard. And that was going to be brought up, and we were going to make an objection to it, so the Republicans wanted to change that. Well, we weren't for that. It's this bill, I think it was, and we weren't for helping you along on it. So we objected, but this is not the same level of concern. we all, each member has the right to object to any unanimous consent request because it's a request for unanimity. And we have to answer if people object to our using the rules. But I think using the rules at one time doesn't preclude someone else from using the rules at another time. And unless we get to the level of you did it to us, we're going to do it to you, I don't think that's productive, and I don't think it's a good use of our time. So I just yield back my
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is now on the gentleman's amendment from Illinois. Those in favor say aye.
I ask for a roll call vote.
The gentleman asked for a roll call vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, nay. Mr. Shimkus? No. Mr. Shimkus, nay. Mr. Walden? Mr. Terry? Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, nay. Mr. Bilbray? Mr. Bilbray, nay. Mr. Scalise? Mr. Scalise, nay. Mrs. McMorris-Rogers? Mrs. McMorris-Rogers, nay. Mr. Olson? Mr. Olson, nay. Mr. McKinley?
Mr. McKinley?
Mr. McKinley, nay. Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner, nay. Mr. Pompeo? Mr. Pompeo, nay. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith, nay. Mr. Barton? Mr. Barton, nay. Mr. Upton? Mr. Upton, nay. Mr. Rush?
Aye.
Mr. Rush, aye. Mr. Inslee? Mr. Inslee, aye. Ms. Castor? Ms. Castor, aye. Mr. Dingle? Mr. Markey? Mr. Engel? Mr. Green? Mrs. Capps? Mrs. Capps, aye. Mr. Doyle? Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Waxman? Mr. Waxman, aye. Mr. Whitfield?
No.
Mr. Whitfield, nay.
Are there any members that want to vote or change their vote? The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that, there were 5 ayes, 14 nays.
5 ayes, 14 nays, so the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments? The gentlelady from California is, for what purpose do you seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
An amendment offered by Ms. Capps of California.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady from California is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is my hope that we can simply all agree to this amendment. We live in a world of limited resources, and my amendment seeks to ensure that those resources are used wisely. As currently drafted, H.R. 2401 would require a dizzying number of analyses of EPA rules. History shows us that it could take years to conduct these studies. For instance, in 2003, Congress asked the National Academy of Sciences to examine the effects of just 2 EPA rules relating to stationary sources. This study took 3.5 years to complete. The TRAIN Act is much more ambitious than this. It calls explicitly for more than a dozen rules to be analyzed, as well as other rules and actions that may be proposed over the next 2 decades. And it doesn't stop there. Because the Clean Air Act allows states and local governments flexibility in how they achieve healthy air, the legislation also requires analyses of potentially hundreds of state and local rules. And it's not even limited to currently proposed rules. All of their analyses must be completed by next August. There is a real question about whether this is even remotely feasible. My amendment simply states that the committee created by H.R. 2401 should perform analyses to the extent they are feasible, given 3 conditions: available information, the limitations of economic modeling, and available funding. It also allows the committee to complete the analyses to the extent the information produced is useful to policymakers and stakeholders. If the analyses are not feasible or not useful, we should not be spending taxpayer resources on them. I'll give you an example. Section 3B1E requires that the committee examine secondary impacts of agency actions in 2030. This provision will require the committee to examine speculative impacts, and these are speculative, so far in the future that is likely to be impossible. And even if they can produce some kind of analysis, it's likely to be practically conjecture, providing little or no value to policymakers. Under this amendment, my amendment, the committee will be able to bypass this requirement if it is not feasible or not useful to do it. My amendment also charges the committee to carry out the law in such a way that it doesn't delay or interfere with other statutory or legal obligations. It's just a common sense argument. It attempts to make a Herculean task more manageable given the time and resource limitations before us. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Does anyone seek recognition to speak in opposition to the amendment? Well, the chair recognizes himself just to say that this amendment would allow the committee to limit the analysis by determining that it is not feasible or not useful to policymakers and stakeholders, or that it would interfere with statutory or legal obligations, which would certainly defeat the import of this legislation. So I would just speak in opposition to the amendment. Does anyone seek recognition? Gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
This H.R. 2401 would require a complicated array of analyses of EPA, state and local rules, and there are resources to be spent on that analysis. Deadlines are tight. Economic analysis so inherently limited. This legislation is likely to produce nothing but guesswork or fail altogether. If the subcommittee is going to approve this legislation, then we should work to avoid this result. The CAPS amendment will provide the committee with the discretion it needs to produce a useful report. EPA's past reports to examine cumulative costs and benefits is instructive. EPA has recently finalized a prospective study of the cumulative costs and benefits of the Clean Air Act. The study began in July of 2001. The analytic design plan was reviewed in 2003. The study was not completed until 2011. That's a 10-year process. The study was reviewed by OMB and outside experts. It was a well-conducted, state-of-the-art study that confirms the tremendous benefits of the Clean Air Act. Unfortunately, the study has been derided by members of the Republican Party. But this legislation proposes something far more ambitious. It creates a new government bureaucracy to comprehensively analyze rules finalized on January 1, 2012 by January 31, 2012. So within 1 month. It doesn't appear to be even remotely feasible. The CAPS amendment is common sense. If analyses are not feasible or not useful, we should not be spending taxpayer resources on them. The idea behind the bill appears to be that we can't trust the EPA. We need to have a report by an interagency government committee in order to understand the effects of regulation. Well, that's the premise. I disagree with the premise, but if that's the approach the majority wishes to use, then we need to trust this interagency committee to use its judgment to produce an analysis that is useful to policymakers, given the severe limitations it will face. So I urge support for the CAPS amendment. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's consistent with your bill, and it would make your bill work. Otherwise, I fear that legislation that is before us today will waste a lot of money, a lot of time, and won't give us very useful information with the tight time frames. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back balance of his time. Further discussion. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Just to speak in opposition of the amendment and just underscore why we're here, which I kind of mentioned in the opening statement. But the number of people unemployed less than 5 weeks grew in the last report today by 412,000 people, which hasn't happened since 2008. That's a scary number. There are 14.1 million Americans that are unemployed. In April and May, they revised the job report down 44,000 jobs. Unemployment in the last 6 months, real unemployment rate is 16.2% unemployment. The average duration of unemployment is now 39.9 weeks. That is a record. That is why we're here. No one doubts the EPA and their role in protecting the health of individuals and the environment, and they're still going to do that. All we're asking is that in this bill, that the impacts on jobs and the economy ought to be considered. And these numbers, it's all about jobs, folks. And so we can continue to have a large federal bureaucracy that puts in more barriers, more hurdles, more costly, longer longevity in permitting, delays like we've seen in every piece of legislation that we've passed through this committee, or we could create jobs. That's really the debate, what we're having today, and we'll go through the legislative process. We'll get this through the subcommittee. We'll pass it through the full committee. We'll get a chance to vote on the floor. I'm going to stand on the sides of jobs, the economy, and holding the federal government responsible when in the debate, as I mentioned earlier, two conflicting rules and regs, greenhouse gases and NOx, conflict with each other to a point that you can't comply with the federal. So if you cannot comply with the federal regulation, what do? You move overseas. And that will not help the job environment in this country today. And I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the time. If there's no further discussion.
Mr. Chairman,
for what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I just can't sit here silently and allow my good friend from my home state to keep demagoguing about jobs as if those who are on this side of the aisle, those who offer reasonable amendments, are not concerned about jobs. I know that for those on this side of the aisle, we have all had long histories in the Congress and even prior to the Congress, fighting for jobs for the American people. And we're concerned as anyone on this committee, on this subcommittee, about jobs. And I think that is the reason why, Mr. Chairman, that we do take note of the impact, the job creation, job expansion impacts of the Clean Air Act. Mr. Chairman, again, I want to repeat, as I said in my opening statement, the environmental protection industry is estimated to have created a range of 3.8 million to 5 million new jobs. And this is under the Clean Air Act. So when did all of a sudden, because in the last few months, since the majority became the majority, all of a sudden now history and facts are being revised to say that the jobs have not been created under the Clean Air Act, or that the EPA have not created jobs. In some instances, and I have to be very honest and frank about this, Mr. Chairman, in my district, if my district suffered from 16.2% joblessness, then we might even consider that a boom, because in my district it's double that, or in some instances it triples that. So don't get up and get on your high horse and talk to me about jobs and and try to lecture me and lecture this side of the aisle about jobs. We're concerned about jobs. We try to create jobs, and the fact is that this legislation, as Mr. Waxman said, this is, let's be honest. This should be called the "We Don't Trust EPA Act." And that would be the most honest thing that you could say. You don't trust EPA. You don't think the EPA is doing what it's supposed to do in order to protect the oil companies and the gas companies. Well, so be it. But let's not try to fool and bamboozle the American public and the American people. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And we are just as much concerned about jobs, and we have been creating jobs. When under President Clinton, jobs were created. Jobs were created. We had a surplus under President Clinton. All right, and now we're suffering from the just the opposite, increased joblessness, and also we're suffering from the fact that the economy is just going down into the tubes. Mr. Chairman, I just think that the disingenuousness, and this is what bothers me, the disingenuousness of those who are proponents of this legislation. Don't come to me or members of this side of the aisle talking about jobs and your zeal for creating jobs. No, you have a zeal for protecting these industries that have outsourced jobs, that have been outsourcing jobs to foreign lands, and not keeping jobs here in this country. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Look, I know everybody's concerned about jobs, but EPA isn't. They're not. It's not what they do. But they know how to destroy jobs. And I'll give you a perfect example. The cement rack rule in my district. This company, Ash Grove Cement, has invested $20 million and reduced their emissions by 96%. EPA wants them to reduce it by 98%. It may put them out of business. It's 116 direct jobs in a county of probably 7,000 people. It's the biggest private sector investment in the county. The EPA will not yield, will not offer up a subcategory. Now, they put off this rule until, well, probably 2013, which is miraculously right after the presidential election, I've discovered. This is real stuff. This company's trying to decide whether to stay or go, how much more they can put in or take out. And if they go, it's 116 direct jobs. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but in my part of the country, if you lose 200 jobs in rural eastern Oregon, it has the economic equivalency, according to the state of Oregon, of losing 25,000 jobs in the metro area. Because you just hollow out the core employment. And we tried for a year, 2 years to get EPA to listen, and they just won't. They don't care. They want purity at all costs. Oh, by the way, the mercury we do get into Oregon comes through the atmosphere ostensibly from China. They don't, and the cement is getting imported from China. I doubt they're living under the cement MAC rule proposed by the EPA. So you are going to offshore jobs. You do it all the time. We actually care about middle-class America and middle-class jobs, and that's what this debate and fight is all about. You can couch it however you want. You can offer up any amendments you want, but at the end of the day, we have agencies that don't take into account the effect of their rules on the American economy. That's why unemployment ticks up another 0.1% or whatever, 9.2%. By the way, I heard that under President Clinton, jobs were created and we had a surplus. You also had a Republican Congress under many of those years. Under President Obama, though, unemployment continues to go up. The so-called stimulus that our kids and grandkids and us are on the hook for $1 trillion that was rammed through here, put into law. We were told, oh, if this goes into effect, you won't have unemployment above 8%. How's that working for you? Well, not working very well for the American taxpayer. And now we got another $1 trillion of debt over time, including interest. It's going to have to be paid back. That's why we're having this fight over the debt ceiling right now. And by the way, those jobs, according to some independent studies, cost taxpayers about $200,000 apiece to create, allegedly. So you've had your shot. You've had your couple of years. You had your promises. And everything that we get back is more regulation, more rule for some cause. And in the meantime, I got 16% unemployment in my district in some counties. They're struggling. And I could point you chapter and verse to federal rule, regulation, and law that has eliminated 271 sawmills in Oregon and 20,000, 30,000 jobs over the last couple of decades, and the lawsuits that go with them because the statutes aren't clear, and so the judges interpret, and we never have the bipartisan work here to change the law very often. We did on the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, and we could on some others. But meanwhile, your forests go up in smoke, and that, by the way, is the underlying issue about asthma in the air is from forest fire smoke. That's what that's about. Chokes your valleys. It chokes your people. And frankly, there are a lot of Democrats who think they don't want to change the law related to forest management. So then you own a lot of these forest fires because your forests, of which we are all the stewards, are overstocked. They are bug infested. If it was public housing, you'd be called a slumlord as the manager if you were the Forest Service. But it's not. So it just burns. It goes up. We don't take out the burned dead trees while they still have value. I could go on ad nauseum. It's time to change. Enough's enough. We have a responsibility to this country and the people who live here to get this economy working again by getting government back at a manageable level. That's what this legislation is about. That's why we should move it forward. We need an economic growth plan for America that works, that is logical, that protects the environment without destroying the economy, and we can do both.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
To address this fine committee for a couple of moments.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I yield to Mr. Waxman.
Well, let me say to my good friend from Oregon, we see it differently. I know that you're unhappy with the decision of EPA. I can't evaluate whether they did the right thing or not. They may have done the wrong thing. You certainly believe that. But that doesn't mean that you throw EPA into a situation where they can't act, that it becomes analysis and paralysis so that we don't get environmental protection. Seems to me we want something more balanced than that. I don't think this bill provides that balance. Now, I must tell you, I don't see that it's fair to blame us or President Obama for the economic distress that this country faces. He became president at a time when our economy was going over a cliff. Wall Street people took risks with other people's money. The CEOs got the full amount of their bonuses while their companies went into the tank, and their shareholders and their employees suffered enormously. And what was the response? Well, the Republicans didn't believe in regulations, so nobody had been regulating these people at Wall Street. They didn't tell them you're acting beyond the rules. This is not what capitalism envisions. In order to make our capitalist system work, oftentimes you need government there. I think you have to respect the fact that the president inherited this terrible economy, the worst recession/depression since the 1930s. How do you get out of it? Well, the Republican approach to this is to slash government spending. Every time you cut spending, you're cutting jobs for which that spending goes, either for the public employees or the contract employees or the people that depend on them to go to all the other jobs because they have the money to spend. Most economists, including the economists that were advising Senator McCain when he ran for president, said at the time that the president took office, there's no lending going on at the banks. Nothing's happening in the private sector. The public sector's got to come in on a temporary basis and get things moving again. Not a single Republican in the House would vote for that stimulus bill. They didn't have an alternative. They just wouldn't vote for it. And it got through, but was very limited in order to get through because of the 60-vote requirement in the Senate. I'm not going to yield yet. I don't believe it's fair to say that stimulus bill didn't help the economy. Without that, we would have had a worse situation. We were going to go into a very deep depression, and that has not yet happened, but it may, especially if some of the Republican ideas of balancing the budget on the backs of the middle class go into effect. So we do view things differently. I respect your judgment. I respect the fact that if we had a lot of time to talk this through, maybe we would find areas where we agree, although we still have areas where we disagree. But this idea that President Obama is responsible, the reason we have the huge deficit is the wild spending during the Bush administration and with the Republicans in the Congress and Democrats. Wild spending. I swore the earmarks before it became popular to do it, because I saw all the frenzy of earmarks, especially after Tom DeLay became the majority leader. It was a political deal. And I must say that the approach that the Republicans are advancing, to me, doesn't make sense. Certainly we've got to reduce the deficit, but you don't do it at a time and in a way that keeps the economy from recovering. The best thing we could do to get the economy going again and reduce the deficit is to get people to work. What is your jobs bill? Well, if this is one of your jobs bill, it simply is saying that the EPA shouldn't enforce the laws that Republicans and Democrats voted for. Well, offer a bill to stop those laws, change those laws, eliminate the EPA, be honest about it. But I don't think the discussion that we've had, and I have to acknowledge with a deep amount of sincerity from my friend from Oregon, is a fair description of how we got to where we are or how we're going to get out of the situation we're in. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose is the gentleman from Oklahoma?
I strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized 5 minutes.
Mr. Waxman's a good man, but I can't believe you say with a straight face that the taxing, the borrowing, and stimulus spending has actually helped our economy. It's done the opposite. There's a jobs report out today that shows that we're lacking in jobs. It's anemic. We're not gaining in that respect. Like Congressman Walden said, it allegedly cost almost $300,000 per job in that stimulus bill, and there was only about 4% of that stimulus money was spent on infrastructure that actually would create some jobs. The rest of it was just on pork barrel spending, and I'm glad no Republican voted for that, because that is not the way out of this economic situation that we're in. And the Obama administration is regulating what it can't legislate, and these rules are hurting people. People are suffering out there. The economy is suffering, and unemployment rates are at an unacceptable level right now. We need to take a different approach. And requiring people to pay more through these regulations is asinine. We shouldn't do it. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it affects people. Congressman Walden came up with great examples. Everyone on this committee could talk about how it affects jobs and the economy in their own districts. And for example, in my state of Oklahoma, we have 3 plants that were told by the federal government if they come up with a state implementation plan and achieve a certain goal on emissions, that would be okay. They worked very hard, and they did a good job to reach the goals that they were told to reach. Yet the federal government, the heavy hand of government, came down and said, no, you need to do this federal implementation plan. Well, what's that going to cost? It's going to cost the citizens of my state $2 billion. It's going to go down to the ratepayers. You know, people are struggling. I got neighbors that have lost jobs. They don't know what they're going to do. And when they hear about this, it's wrong. We need to take a different approach. We don't need to create government jobs. We don't need government spending. We don't need to tax more. What we need to do is create private sector jobs, not census takers and IRS agents, but private sector jobs. This is wrong. We need a different approach. And I respect the gentleman on the other side of the aisle, but I believe their approach has not worked. We need to take a different approach, and that's not regulating to the hilt everything out there. We need to take the human species, and you talk about these snails and different bugs and things that are going to be affected, but what about the human species? We need to think about them, how jobs, how it's going to affect them. That's why this legislation is so important. It's going to focus on that. It's going to have a cost-benefit analysis and show how important this is and how important it is to our economy to not impose these onerous, these burdensome government regulations upon them. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. If there's no further discussion, the vote will occur on the Capps amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. If there are no further amendments, then we will now vote on the bill. All those in favor of reporting out this legislation, the Train Act, signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is reported out of committee.